Thanks for tuning in. You're listening to Gnostic Studies. This evening we'd like to do a lecture continuing with our Gnostic Psychology series, Introduction to Gnostic Psychology. We're on part 6 today, Essence and Personality, which could also be called the real and the imaginary in a person. Before we jump into today's material, let's review what we talked about in the previous class. Part 5. We talked about our own particular psychology, and if we begin to observe ourselves, which is the goal in Gnostic psychology, if we want to acquire knowledge of self, then we need to study ourselves. And the primary method of self-study is self-observation. And this is what we've been discussing in the previous classes, what it is that we're observing. We're observing our interior world, our human machine, our human organism, the 3 brains or 7 centers, depending on how you want to break it down. And we talked about our attitude and character, observing that, separating ourselves from it so that we can observe it. And in the previous class, we discussed this concept of what we call myself is not actually, we could say, real. We could say that it's something we think is real, but that in the end, after observing ourselves enough, we determine that it is inconsistent. This is related to our particular psychology. And as always, this is not something that we should accept or reject. This is something we need to understand through our own study of ourselves. So first we have to recognize that we're a machine, which is what we studied in the previous class, meaning that we react mechanically when we're faced with the diverse circumstances of life, and that we have a particular psychology related to particular ways particular to us, that we react or that we deal with various events in the external world when we encounter them. So, as we observe ourselves more and more, we realize that we're not one, but many. We're a multiplicity. That inside of us we have little I's or egos, I apostrophe S, right? I's or egos that take over the whole and pretend that they are the whole, but really are not. Because they exist for a little bit, like if someone insults us, then we insult them back, and then it disappears. Or whatever it is particular to our psychology, which means that we have an absence of authentic unity. We have egos that take over for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, or an hour, and then disappear. And then we have to pay for those things that they did. So we want to observe this in ourselves. We want to start to discover these things, because the whole point of Gnostic psychology is that we can not only observe them through our self-study, but that we can grasp them, we can grab them, comprehend them, and eliminate them from ourselves, from our own psychology, from our psyche. So that's the work. And this is part of understanding that work. So this idea that we have a multiplicity within us is also called the doctrine of the many. And this doctrine implies that there is a possibility of achieving unity, but it requires a change in the way that we see ourselves. change in the way that we look at ourselves. But this will never happen. We can never transform ourselves if we accept everything in ourselves as ourselves. That is, if we don't see the things inside of us as egos, as psychic aggregates, as eyes, as desires, whatever name we want to give to them. Because when we see them as something separate from ourselves, then we can work on them. If we don't, if we take them all as ourselves, then there's no possibility to change that, because there's no way of working on that. So this is what we're observing inside of ourselves. The egos, the eyes, the desires, the psychic aggregates, whatever you want to call them. And so this is one of the fundamental ideas, that we see ourselves as a multiplicity, as our interior world as a multiplicity, that that we can observe based on the circumstances of life. The external events happen, and then that calls forth certain reactions from our interior world. And then if we observe them, then we can discover egos that we want to eliminate. But if we think of ourselves as already being a unity, then we'll never be seeking to actually achieve unity, because we'll already imagine that we have it. And our imagination will be able to fill up the gap. So the next part of the series builds off of this idea of understanding self, who and what we are. And that requires that we study ourselves. It requires that we gather that data. So today we're going into more information from those who have studied themselves, and we're going to share what they've said they've discovered. Again, we don't want you to accept it or reject it. We want you to understand it. So now we're moving on to part 6, the real and the imaginary human being. Authentic psychology must begin with a division between the real and the imaginary in a person. It is impossible to study the human being as a whole because he is divided into two parts, one which is real and the other part which is almost completely imaginary. In the majority of ordinary people, these two parts are intermixed and cannot be easily distinguished, although they are both there and both have their own particular purpose and effect. In the system that we are studying, these two parts are called essence, which is what is real, and personality, which is what is imaginary. Essence is what is born in the human being, and personality is what is acquired. So let's understand what the essence is, this concept of essence. What makes every newborn child beautiful and adorable is its essence. The essence in itself constitutes our true reality. The essence that each one of us carries within our interior comes from above, from heaven, from the stars. Unquestionably, the marvelous essence that emanates from the note La of the cosmic octave, the Milky Way of the galaxy that we live in. We've got this diagram here on the web page, which shows the cosmic octave. So the Milky Way is our La, the La of the cosmic octave. So our essence comes from the Milky Way, our galaxy, the galaxy we live in. The precious essence then passes through the note Sol, related with our particular sun, and then passes through the note Fa, the planetary zone, the planets of our solar system, and then enters into this world. penetrating into our own interior, related with our own planet, the planet Earth. Our parents created the appropriate body for the reception of this essence that emanates from the stars. This essence is the basis of the human being's physical, emotional, and mental makeup. So, we've said that in the system that we're studying, the two parts that we want to understand, the real and the imaginary, which is what we're made up of. The essence is the part that is real. And the essence comes from the stars. It descends, passing through these various stages or levels before entering into us. And it's related with what's called our inner being, our inner divinity. The essence is a spark from that flame. That flame being the inner divinity. Newly born children are marvelous. They enjoy total self-consciousness, right? Remember the third state of consciousness? They are totally awake. The essence or consciousness is re-embodied within the body of the newly born child. This is what gives the baby its beauty. We do not mean to state that 100% of the essence or consciousness is re-embodied within the newly born child. Actually, only 3% of free consciousness, that normally is not bottled up within the egos or eyes, is re-embodied in the newborn. We have been wisely told that we have 97% subconsciousness and 3% consciousness. The 97% of essence that we carry within ourselves is bottled up, stuffed, inserted within each one of those eyes or egos, which in their conjunction constitute the myself. Obviously, this essence or consciousness bottled up within each eye or ego processes itself according to its own condition, its own conditioning. So, let's understand. We have essence. We've received it from our inner divinity as a spark from that inner divinity that needs to convert itself into a flame. However, unfortunately, only 3% of that essence is able to work and do anything close to that. The 97% is trapped within the egos, the psychic aggregates. And so part of the work is to free the ego from its bottle, which is its conditioning, the way that we've been conditioned, the way that we think, feel, and act, the way that we react mechanically when faced with the circumstances of life, when we encounter external events. So the goal is to free our consciousness so that we have 100% free consciousness, free essence. A small child has no personality yet. They are what they really are. They are essence. Their affinities, tastes, likes, dislikes express their being such as it is. But as soon as so-called education starts, then personality begins to grow. Personality is created partly by the intentional influence of other people, that is, by formal or informal education, right? When our relatives or people we grow up around tell us, this is what you should do, this is what you shouldn't do. So that's informal education. Formal education is like when we went to a class. And so its personality is created partly by intentional influences of others and partly by involuntary imitation of others that the child themselves does. Remember, personality is what is not our own. It's what is imaginary. In the creation of personality, a great part is also played by resistance to people around the child, and by attempts to conceal from other people something that is their own or real. That is, part of what is personality is made up of resisting or trying to conceal the essence, because people around us often say, oh, well, don't do that. Don't act like this. Don't act like that. So essence is essence in the human being is what is their own, what is his own, what is the human being's. Personality in the human being is what is not his own. Again, this is for male and female, but the term his we're using as a singular. Not his own means what has come from the outside, what has been learned, what one reflects, all traces of exterior impressions left in the memory and in the sensations. All words, all movements that have been learned, all feelings created by imitation, all of this is what is not one's own. All this is personality. So we want to understand that personality is something that we acquire. And the essence manifests in the physical world, in a physical body, right? Then as the newborn grows and develops and ages, what happens is through voluntary and involuntary education, and by imitating people around the child begins to develop personality. And personality is also developed through resistance from showing essence or an attempt to conceal the essence. So the point is that personality is not our own. It's not what we really are. It's not essence. So it's important to make that distinction, because clearly we're going to start observing our own personality. We do not accept our personality as who and what we are, because in Gnosis, in Gnostic psychology, we understand the essence as who and what we are. So studying how we've acquired personality, what are our particular personality traits, and breaking those things down so that we can remove the egos that lay in there is a part of the work. So you can see immediately we're already in the second half, right, of the introductory series, that Gnostic psychology is deep. It jumps in. It's not superficial. We want to go to the root. We want to find action items. We don't want to just have some theories. We want to understand really how to change our reality. And that requires working on the personality, working on our perception, as we mentioned before, related with attitude and character, and working on the doctrine of the many, that is, the particular egos, our particular personality, our particular psychology. So personality is all that is learned in one way or another, whether we realize we're learning it or not. In most cases, it is learned by imitation, which plays a very important part in the building of personality. Even in instinctive functions, right? Instinctive functions are related with the instinctive center. We have intellectual, emotional, movement, instinct, and sex. Those are the 5 centers. And then intellectual and emotional have a superior and inferior, which give us 7 centers. So when we're talking about instinctive functions, which we mentioned in detail in part 3, class number 3, even in instinctive functions, which naturally should be free from personality, there are usually many so-called acquired tastes. That is, all sorts of artificial likes and dislikes, all of which are acquired by imitation and mechanical imagination. These artificial likes and dislikes play a very important and a very disastrous part in a human being's life. This is because by nature, a human being should like what is good for them and dislike what is bad for them. But this is so only as long as essence dominates personality, which is what it should do. In other words, when a human being is healthy and normal. When personality begins to dominate essence, and when a human being becomes less healthy, then they begin to like what is bad for them and to dislike what is good for them. This is connected with the chief thing that can be wrong in the mutual relations of essence and personality. Normally, essence must dominate personality, and then personality can be quite useful. But if personality dominates essence, this produces wrong results of many kinds. It must be understood that personality is necessary for a human being, but it must stand in its right place. This is hardly possible because personality is full of wrong ideas about itself. It does not wish to stand in its right place, because its right place would be secondary and subordinate, and it does not wish to know the truth about itself. For to know the truth would mean abandoning its false dominant position and occupying the inferior position, which rightly belongs to it. The wrong relative positions of essence and personality determine the present disharmonious state of the human being. And the only way to get out of this imbalanced state is through self-knowledge. To know oneself is the first principle and the first demand of the ancient mystery schools. We still remember these words, but have lost their meaning. We think that to know ourselves means to know our particularities, our desires, our tastes, our capacities, our intentions, when in reality it means to know ourselves as machines. That is, to know the structure of one's machine, its parts, the functions of the parts, the different parts, the conditions governing their work, and so on. We realize in a general way that we cannot know any machine without studying it. So we must remember this in relation to ourselves, and we must study ourselves, our own machines, as machines. As we have said, the primary means of self-study is self-observation. There is no other way, and no one can do this for us. Each one of us must do it for ourselves. But before this, we have to learn how to observe. So that's why in this series we've been walking you through the ways of gradually sort of understanding observation. What is it that we're observing? We're observing the human machine, we're observing our interior world, we're observing the centers, we're observing our attitude, we're observing the egos. We're trying to walk you in to be able to easily or more easily understand these quite foreign concepts at first. We must understand the technical side of self-observation. We must know that it is necessary to observe the different functions and to distinguish between them, remembering at the same time about the different states of consciousness, about our psychological sleep, and about the many I's or egos in us. Right, so this is what we've already covered. The different functions, and to be able to distinguish them, those are the functions of the 3 brains, 7 centers. And different states of consciousness, we talked about this in the first and second classes. Our psychological sleep, right? If we've been observing ourselves, we will already see this, that we go into a daydream, that we are not aware of ourselves, that we're not in self-remembering. The many eyes or egos in us, that was the previous class, part 5. Such observations will very soon give results. First of all, a person will notice that they cannot observe everything they find in themselves impartially. Some things may please them, other things will annoy them, irritate them, even horrify them. This means that very soon after a person starts to observe themselves, they will begin to distinguish useful features and harmful features in themselves. That is, useful or harmful from the point of view of their possible self-knowledge, their possible awakening, and their possible development. So now we're going to look at the 4 mechanical manifestations of the personality. So there are more things that we can observe. In our self-observation, if we can discover these things, then we can associate them with the personality and see, what's behind them. In observing oneself, a person must always remember that their self-study is the first step towards their possible development. Now let's look at what those harmful features that a person finds in themselves are. Speaking in general, they are all mechanical manifestations. The first is lying. Lying is unavoidable in mechanical life. No one can escape it. And the more one thinks that one is free from lying, the more one is lying to themselves. Life as it is could not exist without lying. But from the psychological perspective, lying has a different meaning. It means speaking about things that one does not know, and even cannot know, as though one knows and can know. People do not realize what a big place in their lives is occupied by lying, or even, if only, by the suppression of the truth. People are unable to be sincere, either with themselves or with others. They do not even understand that to learn to be sincere, when it is necessary, is one of the most difficult things on earth. Starting in this way, a person very soon learns to discover signs by which they can know harmful manifestations in themselves. They discover that the more they can control a manifestation, the less harmful it can be. And that the less they can control it, or the more mechanical it is, the more harmful it can become. When a person understands this, then they become afraid of lying. Not on moral grounds, but on the grounds that he or she cannot control their lying, and that lying controls them. That is, it controls their other functions. The second dangerous feature one finds in oneself is one's mechanical imagination or fantasy. Very soon after a person starts self-observing, they come to the conclusion that the chief obstacle to observation is so-called imagination or daydreaming. A man wishes to observe something, but instead of that, imagination kicks in on some particular subject, and he forgets about observation. He realizes that this mechanical imagination or fantasy, this daydreaming, always carries him away from his more conscious decisions in a direction in which he had no interest of going. Mechanical imagination is also as bad as lying. It is, in fact, lying to oneself. A man starts to imagine something in order to please himself, and very soon he begins to believe what he imagines, or at least some of it. Further, or even before that, one finds many very dangerous effects in the expression of negative emotions. This is the third mechanical manifestation of the personality. The term negative emotions refers to all emotions of violence or depression: self-pity, anger, suspicion, fear, annoyance, boredom, mistrust, jealousy, and so on. Ordinarily, one accepts this expression of negative emotions as quite natural and even necessary. Very often, people even call it sincerity. Of course, it has nothing to do with sincerity. It is simply a sign of weakness in a human being, a sign of a bad temper, of a person's inability to keep their grievances to themselves. A person realizes this when one tries to oppose it. And by this, one learns another lesson. They realize that in relation to mechanical manifestations, it is not enough simply to observe them. It is necessary to also resist them. Because without resisting them, one cannot observe them. They happen so quickly, so habitually, and so imperceptibly that one cannot notice them if one does not make sufficient efforts to create obstacles for them. So really, part of what these four mechanical manifestations is to, the point of them is to give us like flags, like little red flags that we can have internally. When we start to express negative emotions, say to ourselves, I'm expressing negative emotions, I need to resist that, so maybe I need to change what I'm saying, or rephrase it, or stop talking about this subject, because I'm feeding negative emotions. And the fourth thing, after the expression of negative emotions, one notices in oneself or in other people another curious mechanical feature, and this is called talking. There is no harm in talking by itself, but some people, especially with those who noticed it the least in themselves, it really becomes a vice. They talk all the time, everywhere they happen to be, while working, while traveling, even while sleeping. They never stop talking to someone if there is someone to talk to, and if there is no one, then they talk to themselves. This too must not only be observed, but resisted as much as possible. With unresisted talking, one cannot observe anything, and all the results of a person's observations will immediately evaporate in talking. So what we've just given there with those four mechanical manifestations of the personality, as I mentioned, are bullet points that we should, or red flags that we should note in ourselves. Lying, mechanical imagination or fantasy, we could also call it daydreaming, the expression of negative emotions, and unnecessary talking. The difficulties a person has in observing these four manifestations, the expression of negative emotions, lying, mechanical imagination or fantasy, and unnecessary talking, will show a person their utter mechanicity, their utter mechanicalness. So that's why we want to observe these things and resist them, so that we can see, so that we can have evidence of our particular psychology, of the type of reactions that are specific to us. So, but by observing these four mechanical manifestations, this will show a person their utter mechanicalness and the impossibility even of struggling against this mechanicalness without help. that is, without new knowledge and without actual assistance. Even if a person has received certain material, they forget to use it. They forget to observe themselves. In other words, they fall asleep again, and they must be awakened. This falling asleep has certain definite features of its own, unknown or at least unregistered and unnamed in ordinary psychology. These features need special study. There are two of them. So this is how the essence falls asleep. We resist these four mechanical manifestations of the personality, and this will show us the way that we fall asleep. They're identification and considering, which is a type of identification. So the first one is called identification. Identifying or identification is a curious state in which the human being passes more than half their life. A person identifies with everything, with what they say, with what they feel, with what they believe, with what they do not believe, with what they wish, with what they do not wish, with what attracts them, with what repels them. Everything absorbs them, and they cannot separate themselves from the idea, the feeling, or the object that has absorbed them. This means that in the state of identification, a person is incapable of looking impartially upon the object of their identification. So let's say I look at a car or a bicycle or shoes or another human being or an animal. If I'm identified with it, then that means I'm unable to separate myself from it. And what this generally means is that I've forgotten about myself and I just see the thing. I just look at the thing, or I just feel the thing, the object, completely forgetting about myself. But it can be anything. We can be identified with itchy sensation. We can be identified with the taste of a drink, with anything. And that's why Ouspensky, who's the one writing this, but it's actually Gurdjieff giving a lecture that Ouspensky took notes on, he says it's difficult to find even the smallest thing with which a person is unable to identify. Meaning we can identify with anything, no matter how small it is. At the same time, in a state of identification, a person has even less control over their mechanical reactions than at any other time. Manifestations, such as lying, mechanical imagination or fantasy, the expression of negative emotions, and constant talking need identification. They wouldn't exist without identification. In fact, they cannot exist without it. If a person could get rid of identification, then they could get rid of the many useless and foolish manifestations in themselves. Identification, its mean or meaning, causes, and results, is extremely well described in a Christian book called the Philokalia, the ancient Christian text for the instruction of monks. But no trace of understanding it can be found in modern psychology. It is a quite forgotten psychological discovery. I have seen a PDF of that if you're interested, floating around. So I think if you Google it, you should be able to find it. The second, or whatever search engine you want to use, the second sleep-producing state, akin to identification, is called considering. Actually, considering is identification with people or beings. It is a state in which a person constantly worries about what other people think of them, whether they give them their due, whether they admire them enough, and so on and so on. So considering is very interesting because there's two types. external considering, which is giving greater importance to the opinions, feelings of others over our own, and internal considering, which is giving more importance to our own feelings and opinions than those of others. So some people sort of cater to others, and some people cater to themselves. But both of these forms of catering are called considering. But the reality is we could even consider an animal, our pet. We could say, well, I wanted to go to the park today, but the dog wasn't feeling well, and so I stayed at the house with the dog to make the dog feel better. That's just an example of external considering. Considering plays a very important part in everyone's life. But in some people, it becomes an obsession. All their lives are filled with considering. That is, worry, doubt, and suspicion, and there remains no place for anything else. Right? And that's related with their personality, which they acquired through imitation and through the other things we mentioned at the beginning. So obviously, if this is us, if we recognize this in ourselves, this can change. Once we realize that this is not who we are, because we're essence, not personality. The myth of the inferiority complex and many other complexes is created by the vaguely realized but misunderstood phenomenon of identification and considering. Both identifying and considering must be observed very seriously in oneself. Only full knowledge of them can diminish their influence. If one cannot see them in oneself, one can easily see them in other people. But one must remember that one is in no way different from others. In this sense, all people are equal. Let's summarize what we're saying about the real and imaginary parts of the human being. Personality is the term that is applied to everything that we acquire. In the Gnostic esoteric work, the personality is sometimes compared to a bad secretary who is in the front office and occupied with all the ideas, concepts, preconceptions, opinions, and prejudices. It has many dictionaries, encyclopedias of all types, reference books, etc. And it is not in proper communication with the three brains or the seven centers of the human machine. That is to say, with the intellectual, emotional, motor, instinctive, and sexual centers. The ego uses its reference material to translate the information it receives from the senses into wrong internal states. So somebody insults me. Very quickly what happens is that in my personality I've learned, right, which is a reference book, an encyclopedia, dictionary, oh, they insulted me. Well, I should be angry about that. I should be upset, or I should be sad, or I should react in a certain way. Those are the preconceptions, the opinions, the prejudices that I have. So then, the egos do that in the emotional center. Now I feel angry, or now I feel sad. Then let's say maybe the ego wants to use the intellectual center. So now it figures out a way for vengeance, to get back at the person, or to keep an account of them and say, oh, well, that person, made this offhand comment or implied that I wasn't, whatever, and I dislike that. Therefore, I'm going to remember that so that I can get back at them later. So this is an example of the dictionaries, encyclopedias, and reference books of the ego related with the personality. The personality looks those things up. It acquired that through imitation, through formal and informal education, through trying to conceal essence, resistance, all the things that we mentioned before. And so now, based on the external events and the experiences that we had, now we've acquired mechanical reactions which are based on these ideas or concepts, which are really preconceptions, opinions, and prejudices. And those are what create so many problems for us. Because we can't just allow someone to insult us and then just be neutral about it. That is, until we start to work on ourselves and work on the personality. And then we can. We can separate ourselves from it. And it's, well, they want to, they're making themselves look angry, or they're making themselves look like they enjoy attacking others, or they're choosing that method as a way of dealing with a difficult situation or having fun or whatever it is. And we can just sit there and be quiet. We don't even need to react. And internally, we don't react because we are just observing our inner world. So that's why we say that the ego uses this reference material to translate the information it receives from the senses, right, which is the data from the external event, and it translates that data into wrong internal states. So instead of being peaceful, instead of being calm, instead of being forgiving, we become angry, we become sad, we stimulate negative emotions within ourselves. So we want to look at the manifestation of the ego through the personality, because we need to work on these egos so that we can convert the ego into consciousness. That is, we can convert subconsciousness into consciousness. The ego is expressed through the personality, and its expressions are subjective. It says what others said. It narrates what others narrated. It explains what others explained. The personality is formed during the first 7 years of life. The personality is energetic. It is born through habits, customs, ideas, etc. during the first 7 years of infancy and childhood, and is fortified with the experiences of life. The I, or ego, utilizes the personality as an instrument of action. The personality is multiple and has many hidden undertones. Right? This makes sense because we said that internally we're multiple. We have a multiplicity of egos. The karma of previous existences is deposited within it. Karma in the process of fulfillment or crystallization. So this brings up this idea of karma. So in Gnosis, karma, I don't know how everybody uses it, so that's why we want to define it, because you'd be surprised how people define words. But karma, the law of karma, is the law of action and consequence, or cause and effect. Cause and effect. In our Gnostic studies, we use the term to refer to the debt that we have to the universe. Let's say we caused an imbalance in some way in the universe. Well, as a result of that, we're held accountable. So now we owe something, so that we can learn the lesson, so that we can understand why that imbalance is a problem. So we also use the term sort of in opposition to karma called dharma to refer to the credit that we have. That is what we've done that's helped the universe maintain balance. Some people say it's like what the universe owes us, but that's sort of a weird way of looking at it. karma is acquired when we cause an imbalance. The universe is always seeking for equilibrium, for a perfect homeostasis. When we create or destroy something, we're accountable, and the judges of the law of karma take note. The karma that we have belongs to the ego via the personality, because the essence wouldn't be intentionally creating these problems, although regardless of our intention, we still have to pay the consequences for things. The ego does intentionally do things that create imbalance through the personality. The ego is the one that creates karma because it only wants whatever it wants, regardless of the outcome for others, even for other egos within ourselves, and regardless of the outcome that it has for the essence. So since the false personality that we have is a vehicle for the ego, then we must address it and start to see that our personality, our mechanical ways of thinking, feeling, and acting, our habits, etc., only serve to make us acquire more karma, more imbalance, more problems, and then we have to pay. This is why we must observe ourselves and discover how we're allowing the ego to use our personality and use our human machine. Because the sooner that we can stop that, we can stop the acquisition of more karma, of more debt to the universe, which is going to translate into things not going our way, so to speak. Pain, suffering, difficulties. But when we learn how to pay karma, we learn we make ourselves learn the lesson. And this is part of what the personality doesn't want. Because the ego doesn't want to learn the lesson. Because then it won't, it will, I don't want to say it will be powerless, but part of the reason that it has power is because we don't understand some lesson. When we comprehend the ego, when we comprehend why it exists, when we comprehend it as a cause, then we can eliminate it, and so we don't produce that effect anymore. So remember, the essence is what is real within us, and the personality is what is acquired. Essence is the truth in the human being. Personality is the false. But in proportion, as personality grows, essence manifests itself less and less. And it very often happens that essence stops in its growth at a very early age and grows no further. It often happens that the essence of a grown-up human being, even that of a very intellectual and highly, quote, educated person, stops on the level of a child of 5 or 6. Could be even younger than that. This means that everything we see in this person is, in reality, not their own. What is their own, their essence, is usually only manifested in their instincts and in their simplest emotions. There are cases, however, when a person's essence grows in parallel with their personality. Such cases represent rare exceptions, especially in the circumstances of so-called cultured life. Essence has more chances of development in people who live nearer to nature, in difficult conditions of constant struggle and danger. But as a rule, the personality of such people is not very developed. They have more of what is their own, but very little of what is not their own. That is to say, they lack education and instruction, they lack culture. Now you may say, of course, well, culture isn't a good thing necessarily. But in order for us to understand essence, we have to separate ourselves or see that distinction, that opposition in personality, or else we never struggle. to find out who and what we are, to find out the difference between essence and personality. So culture has like kind of a dual aspect, and personality has a dual aspect. That's what we want to understand. Culture creates personality, and at the same time is the product and the result of personality. So culture and personality go together. We do not realize that the whole of our life, everything we call civilization, all we call science, philosophy, art, and politics, is created by people's personality. That is, by what is not their own in them. The element that is not our own, personality, differs from what is our own, essence, by the fact that it can be lost, altered, or taken away by artificial means. So the personality can be lost, altered, or taken away by artificial means, but the essence cannot, because the essence is what we truly are, what we really are. Development is equally difficult for a cultured person or an uncultured person. A cultured person, right, and it doesn't matter what culture this is, whether we say modern culture, indigenous culture, Western culture, Eastern culture, subculture, it doesn't matter. We're talking about a concept of a thing that's created by personality and that creates personality. Remember, culture creates personality. It's one of those aspects that we involuntarily imitate things related with culture, and that is not necessarily formal education. So development is equally difficult for a cultured or an uncultured person. A cultured person lives far from nature, far from natural conditions of existence, in artificial conditions of life, developing their personality at the expense of their essence. A cultured person develops the personality at the expense of their essence. Whereas a less cultured person, living in a more normal and a more natural condition, develops their essence at the expense of their personality. A successful beginning of working upon oneself requires the happy balance of an equal development of both personality and essence, because such balance will give the greatest assurance of success. A very important moment in the work upon oneself is when a person begins to distinguish between their personality and their essence. This is really something that we can do through self-observation. Clearly, it's the essence that brings us to gnosis. So let me read this sentence to you again. A very important moment in the work upon oneself is when a person begins to distinguish between their personality and their essence. Make that distinction within ourselves, that we are not our personality. A person's real individuality can only grow from their essence. Personality is not our individuality, because personality is something that was created through imitation. It can be said that a person's true individuality is their essence, grown up and mature. But in order to enable essence to grow up, it is first of all necessary to weaken the constant pressure of personality upon it, because the obstacles to the growth of essence are contained in personality. The obstacles to the growth of essence are contained in our personality. So if we want to grow, if we want the essence to grow, then that means we have to really work against the personality. And that's what we're going to talk about next week. Let's understand this. if we take an average cultured human being, we shall see that in the vast majority of cases, their personality is the active element. Their personality is the active element in them, while their essence is the passive element. The inner growth of a person cannot begin so long as this order remains unchanged. Personality must become passive, and essence must become active. So that's part 7. Personality must become passive, and essence must become active. Part 7 is activating the essence and making the personality passive. So that's the material we wanted to study today with you guys. We want to open it up for questions and comments. If you have any, please feel free to submit them in the comment area. We are not going to do meditation tomorrow night, or at least we're not planning to at this point. So, and the following week is Independence Day in the United States, so we're going to take that Friday off as well. So we're not going to do meditation for about 3 weeks. We'll start back in first full week of July. But we do want to invite you to the lecture next week on part 7. So we got a lot of well, I don't want to say a lot. We've got some thank yous. We'll thank you guys for your attention, for your participation. For listening. Hopefully it's been helpful, and obviously we wouldn't be here presenting this material if it wasn't useful, and clearly that's what we're trying to give you, is some tools in this wonderful system that allows us to transform our lives, end our suffering, and what I mean by that is mechanical suffering. So we can understand how to suffer properly so that we pay our karma, so that we make the essence active, so that we're genuinely happy. We're not feeding the personality, we're not feeding the ego. And so that's of course the goal of Gnosis, is to get there. And in these next couple classes through the end of July, because August we need to take off the month of August due to personal work-related things going on, but during the month of July, we'll be wrapping up this first introductory series, and then we can vote on what we want to study. Again, we have intermediate studies in Gnostic psychology. We have advanced studies, so we can persist in this psychology if you want to. Some of you have studied it with us before and know it's profound and may take multiple times listening to it for it to click all the way. So we're open to that. But again, thank you for your attention, for your participation. And we won't be doing meditation tomorrow or next Friday, but we will be doing the lecture next week. So we hope to see you then. We invite you to that. And in the meantime, we want to wish you a good weekend and a good work on yourself. We want to encourage you to take advantage of these teachings while we're able to access them so easily. So, have a good one. Thanks for your time.